A 1952 essay on the musical landscape of Europe by Johann Joachim Quantz is one of the most brutal criticisms of music I've ever read. The essay begins with the accusation that the Italians and French have appointed themselves as the judges of music, and that this has been largely uncontested because no other nation up until recently has been able to match their quality in asserting a national style. He calls them self-proclaimed sovereign judges, and claims that the French view Lully as their musical dictator. However, he also acknowledges that Lully did mix the French and Italian styles because of his Italian upbringing, but that this solidified the French style. Now, early on in the essay, he claims that the first 30 years of his century were the pinnacle of singing thanks to Pistocchi and his school of singing. And he applauds Corelli and other Italians for bringing the singing style to the instrumental style. These are the benefits of the Italian inclination towards change, he says. Now, the last 25 years, however, Italians, he says, have gone too far in change and have abandoned the good singing style in instrumental music, forcing excessive ornamentation and virtuosity in their music. He proposes that the rivalry between singers and instrumentalists may have contributed to this, and calls out specific composers, saying of Vivaldi that although Vivaldi's early works provided concerti better form, excessive daily composing and a foray into theatrical vocal works caused Vivaldi to, and I quote, sink into frivolity and eccentricity both in composition and performance. And while I think that he's correct in saying that Vivaldi's foray into theater had an influence on his music, I'm not so sure it's a bad thing. I think that it resulted in a richer drama and poetry in Vivaldi's music. Now, it's also worth pointing out that in Quantz's autobiography, he does say that his encounter with Vivaldi's early music is what shaped him and showed him a new way of composing, he called it. You can hear in Quantz's music, it's very clearly based on Vivaldi's style. Now, Vivaldi isn't the only composer that Quantz attacks. He also attacks Tartini, saying that Tartini's withdrawal from musical society had resulted in the cultivation of a new style on purpose, and that this new style was completely departed from, these are his exact words, the singing style, or at least its good and pleasing qualities. He's cutthroat. Now he accuses Vivaldi and Tartini of having so many graces and wild runs in their adagios, you'd mistaken them for allegros. Which, if you've seen my previous video on Vivaldi's ornamentation of his own works, or just very detailed melodies, you could see why someone might be shocked. Again, I don't think it's a bad thing, but this is a 1752 perspective. Now here are his exact words on the matter. They seek the greatest beauty at the very place where it is not to be found, to wit, the extremely high register, or at the end of the fingerboard. They climb about in the high register, like somnambulists upon the rooftops, and meanwhile neglect the truly beautiful, depriving the instrument of the gravity and agreeableness that the thick strings are capable of giving it. The adagio they play too boldly, the allegro too lethargically. In the allegro, they consider the sawing out of a lot of notes in a simple bow stroke to be some special achievement. And then he goes on insulting their trill speed and double stopping, comparing them to old-fashioned fiddlers, and says, well, good luck if there's an Italian in your orchestra, because if there is any disorder in the music, you can be assured that is because, and I quote, they are playing without using either their eyes or their ears. Quantz is not necessarily an agreeable character in this essay, but it does give us an interesting perspective as to how at least one musician viewed the music of the time. He accuses Italians of overly simple bass lines and middle parts, i.e. homophony. Now this indicates to me at least that the classical style is right around the corner. Quantz notes that he didn't think as many learned critics would praise this style and accuses them of hypocrisy. So this indicates that a pretty significant number of people probably disagreed with Quantz. Now he does praise Capelli, Pergolesi, and sort of backhand compliments Vinci, then characterizes the French as the opposite of the Italians, saying that instead of their over-progressiveness, the French constitute a constant and slavish style, saying that they're too bound to dancing and drinking songs. The instrumentalists, especially keyboard players, do not play anything difficult or embellished. Therefore, at least they don't ruin the composer's music. Quantz here recommends that beginning instrumentalists first visit France to acquire foundational tastes before visiting Italy so that they can distinguish good from bad. He says that French arias are more like talking than singing, and that the French are simply bad singers, and as a result, vocal music is very basic. He says that they have little passage work and that their language simply doesn't allow it. At least, that's what they say, he says. The only advantage, he claims, is that their acting is good, but not their music performing. He accuses the French of being overly diatonic, whereas the Italians are overly chromatic, and that the French place more emphasis on the bass than the principal part, calling the accompaniment plain rather than elevated. He claims, and I quote, "Recitatives sing too much and their arias too little. If an air tendre follows French recitative, you are completely lulled to sleep and lose all attentiveness," which he says should not be an aspiration in opera, where the listener's attention must be commanded at all times. He then says that the French accuse Italians of too much passage work in their arias, and that for 20 to 30 years only French ballets remained performed in Germany, because the French have not evolved, saying that all these countries, Germany, Spain, Portugal, England, Poland, and Russia, all prefer Italian music for this reason, and that only beginners still love French music because it is too easy to play. Now, meanwhile, Paris, he says, has tried to mix Italian and French styles, but has failed ever since Lully died. Again, he says that the French blame their language, that it cannot be set to Italian singing styles, but Quantz says, well, German and English have both succeeded in this, so why not French? He additionally notes that the French despise the German and English language. Now, even his own national style is not free from Quantz's criticisms. Previous German music, according to Quantz, was flat, dry, meager, and paltry, harmonious, but unmelodious, and uncharming. He claimed that Germans composed chiefly artfully, but forgot it must sound pleasing, more for the eye than for the ear. He says that German music had too many cadences and never modulated without a cadence beforehand, and that it had no passion, and that the singing style sounded like ha 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 ha, in other words, choppy, and that it sought to impress with virtuosity in instrumental music instead of pleasing the ear. No rubato, always in tempo, and slow movements always ending with this particular figure, which there is no evidence for outside of Quantz's essay, and that there is a lack of appoggiaturas, which are necessary to bind together a harmony. Now recently, he says, Germans have become the best at taking the good aspects of other national styles, crediting Pachelbel, Reinken, Buxtehude, and Bruns for composing the first agreeable instrumental works in Germany. He also credits the Netherlands for giving Germans the art of playing the organ, and mentions J.S. Bach, saying that he perfected the German style, which he may not be wrong about, though he feared that Bach's style would go out of fashion and that few would apply it. He complained about young German organists for about a page, and claimed that they might kill all that Germany has built because they are not learning from the masters, such as Bach. Though he also says that German taste in music improved in 1693 with the importation of Italian-style singing in Hamburg by Kusser and the success of Reinhard Kaiser. He blames financial, musical, circumstantial, and religious obstacles for the lack of evolution of music in some parts of Germany, saying that some areas still compose in an unseasoned style. Now here he says the main point of his essay, that Germans had perfected the mix of Italian and French music. He says that those in Italy and France refuse to learn foreign languages or are just too prejudiced in music, that they believe their styles and languages are the only good ways forward. Therefore, German music, he states, is the best style, and to maintain it, young composers in Germany must pay more attention to the rules of composition and stop focusing only on melody, once again accidentally hinting at the cusp of the classical era. He calls, then, for Italy and France to imitate Germany to initiate a universal good style. Now, obviously, Quantz here is not necessarily, in retrospect, correct in this essay. There should not be, in my opinion, a universal good style. I don't think that's possible, and I think that diversity in music is important and leads to the invention that Quantz seems to oppose so much. But Quantz's essay is valuable in that it gives us a historic perspective as to how one musician may have viewed the music of and before. Thank you for watching, and if you have any thoughts, do you agree with Quantz in some aspects? Do you disagree with him more? Let me know. I'm more on the disagreeing side, but I do think that what he writes is extremely interesting and tells us a lot about the music of the time and whether it was liked, at least by one person. Thanks again.